Hey everybody, Nathan Baird from the Indy Star back for another edition of Boilers Extra. I'm going to be joined here in a few minutes by James Crepea. He covers Oregon for OregonLive. One of the best sports writers around for my money, and a guy I've known for a long time. And he's going to have good insight on the Ducks for Friday's big game at 8 o'clock at Ross-Ade Stadium. Just came back from actually my second night practice of the week for Purdue football. They have been holding their interviews after their evening practices. Obviously, a Friday night game coming up, they decided to just move the practices into the evening to get accustomed to playing at night, something that they've had some games that sort of ended in the nighttime. Oregon State, I guess, jumps out to me as one, but none that have started and been a night game. And you're acclimating to some weather things that are going on right now too. A little bit cooler temperatures at night, so understandable why they did that. I asked tonight if they'll do the same thing for Michigan State. Didn't ask Ryan Walters, just asked some people around, and they said they weren't sure yet because they've got another game on a Friday night at Michigan State later this season. So something that if things go well Friday, maybe it's more likely that they would do that again. But Oregon, obviously number 2 team in the country, they are coming off a 32-31 thriller of a win over Ohio State. Just one of the most anticipated Big Ten games of the season, and lived up to its billing and had some controversy and stuff around it that you can go read about. It's not really relevant to what we'll talk to James about this week, but I'm also going to talk to James a little bit about Big Ten hoops because Oregon has had a solid program for several years now, and Purdue plays out in Eugene as part of its Northwest swing later this year, and he can give us some insight on how that is going. So, quick note, I will be doing post-game pods on the YouTube channel for those of you who follow that or want to get that. The thing is, I don't know when that will post. We have a quick turnaround. You got an 8 o'clock kickoff, then we get home after working covering that, and then we've got to be back at Mackey for the fan day at noon on Saturday. So it might be a brief pod, and it may not be live very long. So, but for those of you who enjoy that, it will be up. I'll have something to say after we find out how Purdue does against Oregon. So to talk about the Ducks, we're going to bring on James Crepea. James, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Nathan. I appreciate it. Thanks again for having me on what is a short week for all parties.
Yeah, indeed. And you have your background covers a lot of ground. Like you're from New York. You spent some time in the SEC. You've been at Oregon for a while, but you went to school in Big Ten country at the Ohio State University. Is this going to be your first trip to Ross-Ade? Were you here as a student at any point?
Yeah, it'll actually be my first trip. It's unusual in that way, but yes, my time many moons ago, and I'm reminded exactly how many years ago that is all the time. But it's been a hot minute, nearly 20 years now. But yes, it has been some time. I'm quite familiar, obviously, with the Big Ten and Big Ten history and Purdue and etc., and particularly Purdue's history with Ohio State.
Well, sure, yeah,
and some of its more recent occurrences of some rather monumental upsets that nobody expected either. So that it certainly is probably most well storied in terms of Ohio State's background, but certainly not the only ones. And Oregon, I'm sure for your audience, yes, that they are very much hoping that Oregon is just the latest of the ranked ilk to fall miserably, despite being a monumental favorite for Friday's game.
And historically, it's been number 2 teams. Like I was there for the 2018 game where they beat Ohio State. That was a number 2 team, and for some reason, it's been the number 2 teams that they've been able to step up and trip up and get these big upsets. So I guess that's something for Duck fans. If they're worried about anything this Friday, maybe it's that. But the other thing I guess maybe they could be worried about is Purdue is coming off an emotional game. Like they finally had a breakthrough on offense and competed till the final seconds of a game, losing overtime against Illinois. So they have to recover from that for a short week. But Oregon's dealing with some of those same things. I mean, one of the most anticipated games in the country, they come out on top, and then they're the ones that have to travel cross country. How is Oregon approaching this short week? What effect, if any, do you think it could have on, if not the outcome of the game Friday, then maybe how it's played?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the short week aspect of it, combined with the travel, and then you add in, oh yeah, by the way, and what's the game you're coming off of? That all kind of, if you had to draw up the ideal circumstances for a team like Purdue in this situation, you would probably have drawn up this. And if you were to probably draw up the least ideal circumstances from Oregon's perspective, this would be it. A short week, Eastern time zone, etc., following a highly emotional and competitive win and physical game and all those sorts of things. So, again, competitiveness, talent outside of it, notwithstanding, the 6-0 number 2 team, if you had to draw it up for them, this would probably be the least ideal of circumstances. And if you had to draw up the circumstance for the other side, this would probably be the most ideal. Because for the Eastern time zone trips that are going to come for Oregon later this season to Michigan and to Wisconsin, they're going to be traveling on Thursday and giving themselves the extra day to acclimate time zones, etc. I don't think you can really acclimate to weather that quickly, and who knows what the weather will be when it comes game time and all those sorts of things, but more so for body clock purposes and those things.
Yeah.
But having said that, with a later game, I'm not sure that the body clock issue will be as big a deal. And I think that's kind of what Oregon's banking on. And that from a practical standpoint, they couldn't have traveled Wednesday anyway with class and those things. But ultimately, with a later game, it's one thing. If it were, again, going on a Saturday and you have like a noon kickoff Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific, that's where you could get a little bit more potentially challenging in those things. And I think part of why they're leaving on Thursdays those weeks, combined with ultimately, though, even that, Oregon practices at 9 a.m. locally. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure, and therefore they're in the facility. Yeah. Most of the players are in the facility between 6 and 7 a.m., or some even earlier. So bottom line, I'm not even sure those issues. I think we kind of all make more of a thing of it. And I know what the record is at the moment, but at the same time, not for nothing, Oregon hasn't made the East Coast trips yet.
Right.
This is the first one. So let's wait until the data sample gets a little bit bigger before we start proclaiming what the 3 time zone trips impacts are respectively. But ultimately, for a Friday game on a short week, coming off the kind of game that it was, not the ideal set of circumstances that Oregon would draw up, combined with say nothing of, look, hey, this is the bigger picture thing. Oregon's in the midst of being hosed by way of the conference schedule, not just this after the Ohio State game and the Friday before that down at UCLA. Their 2 Fridays are in the span of, a 14-day period.
Yeah.
You also have, this is the only team in the league who's got 8 straight weekends of conference games. In a double bye season, that's, you want to talk about an anomaly. That's bizarre. But for whatever reason, the conference schedule featured this for Oregon's purposes. So like I say, now, has anybody made any excuses or anything like that about it? Absolutely not. But it's another unusual circumstance. They're in the midst of it. It's not, it's game 4 of that 8-week gauntlet. But one that I think they'll be very happy to get through insofar as the 2 Fridays in particular and to hit that kind of midpoint of this, like I say, this 8-week gauntlet that simply nobody else has.
For what people who don't know, the thing you kind of referenced in passing there's a trend right now where the team, I can't remember if it's East going West or West going East or both. It's the team that's traveling has a terrible record right now. I can't remember what it is.
I believe it's 3-10 or 3-11,
something like that.
Big Ten specifically, because there's obviously ACC teams who've done that as well, and some
specifically within the Big Ten, the new Big Ten. But the favorite has won like almost all the games. Like there hasn't been a lot of. It's not like there's been a lot of upsets happening. So that's kind of.
You mean UCLA hasn't pulled a monumental upset?
We'll see. It's a short season, or it's a long season. We're only halfway through. I'm just curious, like, how does Oregon feel about? I mean, it probably feels pretty good about the Big Ten, other than what you were talking about right now with the big win over Ohio State. But I guess just from a fan standpoint, like, what's the vibe you're getting about Oregon now being part of the Big Ten? Because now it's real. It's been like this, theoretical thing for a couple of years or past year or whatever. But now they're living in it. They are a Big Ten program.
Yeah, I mean, look, for what I've heard and caught from the audience for the better part of nearly a year and a half now. Really, if you want to go back to when the LA's left, and it was the yearning for being in the same footing, and of course they now
Mm.
are. Was look, they saw this as an eventuality, so it's like that which should be done eventually should be done immediately. And it was just the question of would the Pac 12 be able to cobble something together to hang on for a few more years. And when I say a few more, if you think it would have made it one more, multiple rights deals deeper,
No.
clearly not, because one of the parties who's involved in the entire process, obviously television, was driven and motivated to get to where we got to when we got there. So, with that said, once, however which way the dominoes fall by way of sequencing, ultimately, Fox didn't want it. That's all there is to it.
Yep.
Once Fox says, hey, we really aren't interested in having this conference be a thing. We'd rather just see the corner schools go over there and see the the Northwest schools join the LA schools over here. Well, and that's kind of the end of the story. And then the exact sequence of who left when and who made the decision when and who was motivated, they were all motivated by money. Let's not make one more than the other. They're all motivated by money. So, okay, so we got there. So bottom line, what are fans feeling like? Fans are feeling ecstatic from the initial decision. And of course, now off to a very nice start with that win, and a win that's the biggest in terms of for a home game and the biggest home game in program history. And one could argue one of the biggest wins in program history, because they have never beaten a number one team. And they have only beaten a number two team one other time, and that was Florida State in the Rose Bowl in a semifinal.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, that obviously was big and put them in a national championship game and the like. So you can quibble about which one was quote unquote bigger. But I think for many, because of the home game element, yes, Florida State was the reigning champion, et cetera. Yeah, but that ended with obviously a loss to Ohio State in the national championship, and a pretty lopsided one as well, compared to this, where call it what it is. This is the question of, hey, how elite are they right now? How far along are they in this process? And a process that, for Dan Lanning's purposes, began 2.5 seasons ago with 49-3 in Georgia to the reigning champions and then eventual champions. All right. How far away are they? And when Kirby Smart says at that time, they just don't have the players. Well, whether they had held on to win last week, or Ohio State hits a field goal late, or they miss the field goal with 1:40 and change left and they lose, they showed that they are very much on equal footing with the elite. So now the fan base is very much supercharged in that way, and planning accordingly in terms of the postseason. And again, a season that obviously began with a lot of high goals, aspirations, and dreams for Big Ten championship, CFP spot at minimum, and not just get there, but do damage when you're there, whether you're hosting or whether you're in a quarterfinal, semi, ultimately doing damage and contending with the best. And the only way you're going to feel particularly confident once you get there is if you prove a few things along the way. And yes, they proved it last week, and we'll probably have a couple of more instances to at least further validate that along the way, by the way, and frankly, even including on Friday, because look,
yeah, it's a different.
They
kind
are
of
big
challenge.
favorites. Yeah. Exactly. It's a different challenge. It's all the things that we already mentioned: the short week and road and Eastern time zone and coming off the win. Yes, all those things. And how do you handle yourself after success? Unparalleled success, unmatched success. Can't act like there's a whole bunch of guys here outside of the coaching staff. Can't act like there's a whole bunch of players who, well, they've been there before. A couple of them were there for the Ohio State win in 21. Yeah. And of course, the seasons kind of go the way they go. And not for nothing, Oregon slipped up at Stanford that year. And there was a lot of circumstances to how and why, but ultimately it did. All right. So for those few players combined with anybody else who's come in since, how do you handle this success, this challenge, this task, whether it's this week or against Illinois or at Michigan or whatever the case may be?
And this is another circumstances week that's kind of what you're saying. Like, this is the new challenge. Like, you've done the thing at the elite. Now, how do you bounce back and protect yourself against an opponent that you're supposed to go in and roll past. As I was looking at what Purdue did last week and where it had some real progress on offense and where Oregon might be vulnerable, I'm just trying to find things where this game could get interesting. Oregon's faced a couple of quarterbacks, Giovanni McCoy from Oregon State, and the guy from Aiden Childs from Michigan State, formerly of Oregon State, who were able to run the ball on them a little bit. Ryan Brown did a good job of that last week with the zone read. Is that somewhere where Oregon has had some vulnerabilities and where Purdue might be able to do something on offense?
A little bit, and I stress a little bit. You had that where McCoy, it didn't last long. It was really like one possession, to be honest. And then Childs, he certainly prolonged some plays. They also got after him pretty good.
Right. Both of those cases, especially in Child, I think they sacked him 4 or 5 times.
Yeah. So that's where ultimately they actually did a pretty good job at keeping him between the tackles. They really did. There were a couple of instances he managed to break free, but really they got after him. Now that O-line also was pretty rough, to be fair. But be that all as it may. The other contextual point for both of those is that Jeff Bassa, who's their best linebacker, he was dealing with an ankle injury for both of those games and was really limited to third down passing downs in those spots where he's also greatly improved over his career in coverage. So whether he was in the third down for pass rush purposes, which he is capable of, or he was in for coverage purposes, he was limited by way of reps. That's no longer a concern. So you add that to one of the younger guys who's really coming to his own, and Devin Jackson, who did quite well in that Oregon State game, starting with that one and then for the week since, to where you have a guy who needed more opportunities to come into his own and has, paired with the leader of the room, paired with a Bryce Betcher who's leading them by way of tackles and production, in part because Bassa was not playing as many first and second down reps for several weeks. And yeah, you've got a pretty solid linebacking situation for those instances where you either need to spy or better contain outside of the defensive line a potentially mobile quarterback. So did they allow a few things? Yes, but none of them were that incredible. They were both awfully limited by way of duration. And, oh, yeah, by the way, their best linebacker was limited also in terms of snaps in those games. Now, look, I think the biggest vulnerability that this defense has shown at all was to Ashton Jeanty, which,
but I mean,
that's standing the test of time.
Yeah.
That is being really overblown by people who look at the box score, and he had a big night. Let's not pretend otherwise. But his big night came on 4 carries. They really held him in check for 20 or 21 carries, and 4 broke big. Now, they broke real big, but that guy is going to do that to everybody, and he very well might win the Heisman. So in the grand scheme of things, if you give any defensive coordinator in the country and get them and say, hey, Ashton Jeanty is going to have either 24 or 25 carries, and you're going to hold them inside 5 yards on 20 or 21 of those, how you feel? Everyone is going to sign up and say, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, they'll take that.
And, you're going to hope to just that the other 4 aren't for, 50 plus a piece. But yeah, you're going to sign up for that kind of batting average against that running back who's probably the best running back in the country.
And the other side of things, I mean, people probably already know about Dylan Gabriel and a little bit of what Oregon offers offensively. The Purdue defense this season has been, let's say, volatile, and there's been good stretches, but it's obviously susceptible to some big plays and a lack of getting off the field. Do you think as you look at this matchup that Oregon might be giving a team like Purdue the most trouble just because of its talent?
Oh, the most trouble by far is going to be outside receivers. And just the speed it's hard for a lot of teams to match up with. It's hard for a lot of teams. mean, look at what happened last week. Ohio State walks in and says, haven't allowed a pass at 30-plus yards all season, albeit the 3 MAC schools in there, but so be it. Nobody broke free for anything, so they hadn't allowed a 30-plus yarder, hadn't allowed a 100-yard receiver since the 22 Peach Bowl against Georgia. And Ohio State's, comes in with NFL talent all over the field. And Oregon proceeds to say, well, nobody's tested you. And we got the horses. So let's see what you got. And you have Evan Stewart and Tez Johnson both just below the top off on Denzel Burke over and over and over again. And Oregon hits 4 passes of 30-plus, including a 69-yarder to Stewart, a big touchdown pass to Johnson, a crosser of sorts to the tight end that then breaks free as well. And while he wasn't matched up exactly with Burke, he ended up bowling him over anyway. So they went right after him and were totally unafraid. So I would say the speed on the outside of Johnson, who's a returning 1,000-plus yard receiver from a season ago, and backing it up yet again, and Stewart, who had his breakout performance in his career performance last week, mainly at the expense of Denzel Burke. Yeah, you start there. And that doesn't take away from their running game. That doesn't take away from their tight end, who's probably one of the best in the conference, if not the country, in Terrence Ferguson. So it's not as though they can't attack the middle the hard way either. But in terms of where it would be the biggest disparity, there are not a lot of teams in the country who are going to have the outside corner speed, but to counter what Johnson and Stewart bring. Very, very few teams are going to be able to do that.
Yeah, and for Purdue fans who aren't that familiar, like Denzel Burke is a guy who is probably a day 2 NFL pick, or at least we thought so, trying to prove he belongs in the first round. And the one of the big narratives on the beat that I used to be on, and the one that you still follow as an Ohio State alum, is how he got just scorched this past week. So definitely something for a Purdue secondary that's had some issues at times this year to be concerned about. I want to switch over and talk about hoops, because that's obviously people are already transitioning to hoops. They're probably wondering why we haven't started talking about basketball even earlier in this podcast. It's right around the corner. Purdue is actually holding a fan day on Saturday in conjunction with a lot of things that are going on this weekend. You and I were at Big Ten Football Media Day, and there was a lot of different people asking for football about the concept of like a Big Ten style of play and how the West Coast schools are going to adapt to that. Do you think there's anything to that in basketball as well, just because of how rugged the Big Ten reputation is, and something that teams like Oregon are going to have to adjust to in some way?
I think there's something to that. Yeah, I do. Look, I think ultimately that the top couple of teams in the Pac-12 in basketball really had separated themselves in terms throughout the tenure of the Pac-12. Obviously, UCLA and Arizona, that goes without saying. And depending on the time and depending on the exact season, Oregon was ahead of one or both of those programs. Those were the 3 that carried the flag throughout the Pac-12 era as we know it. So will UCLA be just fine? Yeah. No, not to say that they're going to be perfect and that they're coming in as the favorite or something like that. No,
they're doing all right.
They've
got a good coach.
They're doing okay. They're doing okay. And frankly, Mick Cronin, frankly, a lot of Midwestern fans should know from his time at Cincinnati.
Yep. They beat Purdue in the first round of the NCAA tournament in 2015.
They play a certain kind of defense. Like, that's kind of his hallmark. A certain level of physicality. It's kind of part and parcel to a Mick Cronin team. So like I say, I think they'll be just fine. For that matter, Oregon, when they have the horses, and this season they have a full roster for the first time since 1920. They're utilizing all 13 scholarships. And, so that's rare in and of itself. And for the last 4 years, they have just been ravaged by injury at one spot or another. And that was a big part of why they missed the tournament for a couple of years and were in the NIT, and why up until a magical Pac-12 tournament run and win, they were in line for a 3rd straight year this past season. But lo and behold, they caught fire and did what they did. Now, the 2 guys who carried them aren't here anymore. but they have a totally reshaped roster. So it's kind of hard for a lot of people, those of us locally included, to know exactly what to make of them, because quite literally half the roster is newcomers, which is not new to college basketball by any stretch of the imagination. But it's like, well, what does the team look like? It's like, well, I could probably tell you about 3 guys in the starting lineup. I could feel mildly confident about projecting the full 5, but I'm not even sure how much of that really matters, particularly early in the season, because 1, they have depth and proven depth and guys who played a lot of basketball. And 2, because I think some of it, they're going to be sorting out lineups and rotations like many teams do for a little while. I'm not sure that it's going to be absolutely rock solid, but ultimately they're going to, like Dana Altman told us today, look, they're going to get back to playing the way that they like to play and want to play, particularly defensively. That's another hallmark of Altman. You know, for as much as and as wide open as his offense can be, and player friendly as it can be, and offensive, really when they really have the talent, can put up some big points. They are built on a pillar of winning the rebounding battle, of holding opponents under 70, really under 60 if you can afford it, but under 70. And if they hit these various main pillars of his, system, their win rate is extraordinary. It's like north of 85 or 90%. So they know the formula to win. And again, like Oregon gets kind of billed as offensive centric, even in basketball. And some of their best teams have been, and carried by some really, really explosive players. But their recipe for success is on the defensive end. So will there be some adjusting to some grinded out style? I think particularly some of the bigger, physically taller teams. I'd say the abundance of height in this season specifically, where they only have 1 true center on the roster, and a whole lot of really long wings. But that's where their size is, long wings. They're probably going to be, for Big Ten purposes, comparatively speaking, a smaller lineup, relatively speaking. Like, they don't have multiple 7-footers out there. They got 1. Now, he may be pretty darn good. He's coming off a season where he lost a lot of time due to injury, illness, those sorts of things. But bottom line, yeah. Will there be some adjusting and adapting? Yes, because I do think there is something to be said for that. Having said that, when they have played some Big Ten teams, most recently, the last couple of years, done awfully well, because they may not, for whatever they may lack in height at times, they have usually made up for with just vastly superior athletes. Remember, they pulled the quote-unquote upset in the bubble or otherwise against Iowa and basically ran them out of the building in Indianapolis back in 20. Michigan, they went to Ann Arbor, again, many years ago now, but they won there in overtime in 1920. And then in this past season, which I fully understand was not a Michigan team of lore by any stretch, but this wasn't an Oregon team of supreme dominance by any stretch of the imagination until it got to the end of the season. And they won that. So that said, will there be some adjustment? Yeah. I think some of the biggest adjustments will not just be in the height, will be also in the intangible. What I mean is, outside of Arizona, I wouldn't even put UCLA in this category, only occasionally. This is not a program that is used to playing in packed barns. They're not. The average look at what the average attendance is and was in the Big Ten for men's basketball.
Big Ten leads the nation every year.
Yeah, and compare that to what some of the average attendance figures were across the Pac-12, particularly outside of Arizona, Oregon, and UCLA. I mean, you want to talk about some empty barns. Oh my goodness, this ain't Pullman, man.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Actually, it was going to be my next question, because Purdue plays at Oregon later this year. They do the Eugene Seattle combo as their West Coast travel this year, and I wonder how many Purdue fans, first of all, know that it's Knight Arena, not Bob Knight Arena, Matthew Knight Arena. But I just kind of wanted to get maybe your give us some vibes, like what is a game experience like at Knight Arena? If there's any fans who are going to try to make that trek, or we probably have some West Coast listeners who might be trying to get up there for that. What's it like at Knight Arena?
So let's put it this way. I'm going to be curious to see what it starts to become in this league. And it's like, well, what could really change? It's like a lot of things could really change. First off, starting with the caliber of the opponents to where fans actually have an incentive and a reason to pour out in big numbers again. Attendance had waned, particularly after COVID, for a couple of seasons. And then again, to match that with team performance, and you really had a recipe for declining attendance. They hadn't had a sellout in quite some time, despite just year after year after year of 20-win seasons for all of Dana Altman's tenure. And again, we can always caveat 20 wins and, try to take away from it. But ultimately, like, that's still a bellwether of some degree of success. They're not achieving it against absolute pincushions, even in years where the Pac-12 wasn't particularly good. Frankly, somebody still had to get the wins. And yet, it's hard to really say, hey, come out and support this team that didn't make the tournament last year or maybe the last 2 years. And, oh, yeah, they've been ravaged by injury. And now watch a midweek game against Cal or Stanford, for that matter.
Right.
And Washington State got better the last couple of years, and that's what allowed Kyle Smith to get out of there. But ultimately, there's some hard sells in there. Utah hadn't been good in quite a while. And even Colorado, when they're competitive and good and had NBA level talent. Yeah, but like you say, but when Michigan comes to town, even when they're bad, that's the big draw.
You think it's more of an event? Like the Oregon basketball games could be more of an event, even though it's now teams from across the country.
Now, yes.
Like Rutgers could actually be a bigger deal than
way bigger.
Washington State, whatever.
Way bigger. Way bigger. Not even close. Yeah, especially if they come in ranked in like the top 15 or something, which they very well could. Yeah, those kind of games, absolutely. Because, like I say, this is a fan base that's just been yearning for not only their own team to be good, but to watch another team who's worthwhile. Again, Houston came in here higher ranked, and there was a bigger crowd for Michigan. Baylor came in here, and all right, that crowd was pretty good. But outside of the in-state game with Oregon State, even some of the Washington ones, now granted, Washington hasn't been particularly good, but ultimately, you just don't have that draw. Then all of a sudden it's, Michigan in December. And you go, they're not very good. Oh, don't matter. One, the game was like 4 years overdue.
Yeah.
And two, it was, it's the brand, it's the name. So when they have the opportunity to play, you name it, Purdue, Iowa, Indiana, Michigan State. And I'm not disrespecting anybody or forgetting anybody. I'm just saying, those brands, those names, hey, even the layperson who's a college basketball fan who's not following every night, but knows, they're probably pretty good. Frankly, even if they're middling, they're probably better than 80% of the Pac-12 teams I've watched here for the last 10, 12 years, if they're a fan, kind of thing. Yeah, those are the sorts of things that I think are going to add to the building environment. That's just going to be different than it was before, or before you saw it maybe once a season. Now you're going to see it far more regularly, for one. Two, with that and the revenue to come, frankly, Oregon has a lot of improvement to be had by way of in-arena experience for fans. But some of that is like the chicken or the egg argument. Some of that is you need the fans to be there in the first place, and some of that is, but you need to give them a reason, the bells and whistles, the pyro. There's no pyro here. You hear Oregon, you think there's just going to be massive explosions and laser light shows and, the duck repelling from the ceiling or something like that. No. There's a 90-second video shown. The arena gets dark. They show the thing, and here are the players. I
think they just need some initiative, though. I think maybe you should just go get the duck costume. You can be the one that rappels down pregame.
Ride the Harley inside. Yeah. Hey, look, like I say, there's any number of areas that they can spruce things up there. But I think the opponents alone and the schedule alone is going to go a long way to doing that once they get into January in particular, that's going to really add to it. Now, that said, the arena itself, it's fine. Will it probably get better in terms of an arena environment with bigger games, and has been for particularly big games? Oh, yeah. I mean, it can get loud in there. It can. It really can.
Cool.
But is this the most intimidating, road environment or whatever? No, let's not make it out to be. Like there are many the collegiate arena that like this, but this almost play. I wouldn't call it like it's not NBA style where like there's some really really sanitary environments there, but you would put it more towards a professional sort of setting. Like you don't have a wall of sound. Let's put it that way, or you don't have a student section that's just so enormous and so right on top. No, there are many the collegiate environment that are more collegiate in feel. This is kind of a cross between a bad NBA team environment and probably like a middle of the road by way of collegiate sort of a setting. No one's going to confuse this, like I say, with some of the more ruckus
Purdue
environments.
Frankly, Mackey Arena. Mackey Arena. Yeah.
Nobody's confusing with that. Yeah.
And I wonder if these former Pac-12 players are going to maybe sort of enjoy this, like this getting to go on the road to some of these environments, because it's you go in as the villain. It's not easy, but players. I remember doing a story a few years ago about how tough it is to play in Mackey because the fans are right on top of visiting players and it's loud. And was going around at Big Ten Media Day and talking to players. And there's some players who had stories about you can't even hear yourself think. But then there's other players who are like, yeah, but that like got me hyped. And like then I was like, I wanted to go. So I'm curious if that's going to bring out the best in some of these former Pac-12 teams. But James, I've kept you around for a long time. I know you've got a lot of stuff to do before you get on a plane to come out here. So safe travels. And thanks for joining us tonight. We will see you in Ross-Ade Stadium on Friday night.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, James. Still learning how to, for those watching the videos, still learning how to do that part of the job. Looking ahead to Friday night, I want to check the line here because I'm not sure. It was about 27 points earlier in the week. And obviously we had a big line jump in the middle of the week last week, which told us, if you're listening to the podcast, told us what news might be coming. This one opened at almost 30. It's been bet down to about 27 and a half at most of the lines. I mean, I think that is probably a good range considering the circumstances that Oregon is going to be playing in and having to deal with the travel and the short week. And there's maybe even some unknown here for Purdue and what they did last week and people maybe giving them some credit for that. But I'm still thinking this is like 41-10, something in that realm. And that's probably that could, if things go the wrong way, that will end up being maybe on the good side for Purdue. And it's not me trying to talk crud about them, but let's just be honest with what we've seen on the field most consistently this year. Does that seem like a team that will hang with the number 2 team in the country? I'm skeptical of it, but you can't deny that there was progress last week in some important ways. Not on defense. Defense is still too volatile, and they've got to rein that in. They've got to start making tackles. I was talking tonight to KJ Jenkins. I was talking to Hudson Miller, who's been playing more Mike linebacker now that Jenkins has been playing more rush end again. And just about the concept of like missed tackles and how that is such a could just hit a team's psyche. And it's one thing to give up a big play. Maybe they did something schematically, or like Jamal Edrin does that double move on the sideline against Illinois and gets open for the 53-yard, 57-yard touchdown bomb, whatever it was. That's one thing. But when you've got a guy and you just gack it and miss the tackle and he goes off for an explosive, or it's the difference between you had him stopped on 3rd down and you don't get him stopped and it extends a drive, like those things I think wear on a team. And I think as teams have had success against Purdue this year, sometimes it has been out in the clear, but I'm not telling you anything you haven't seen. Sometimes it is they have a guy in position and he doesn't make the tackle, or he's late getting in position and can't get the right form to make the tackle, and it's too late and the guy's gone. And I still think that is a thing that if they just tighten it up, it doesn't have to be a big schematic change. But if you tighten that up and you take a D plus defense and make it a C minus or something like that, I'm just pulling numbers out of the air, letters out of the air, grades out of the air, then you're just trying to win games at this point. You're trying to win any games. It's not really about proving something. I don't think at this point. Are you competitive the way you should be competitive against the teams that you play? And the standard for that, frankly, let's be realistic, is different when you're playing Oregon than it will be against Northwestern, Michigan State, and I'm going to go ahead and still throw Indiana in that list. So those, I think, are the three that you look at right now. Can this team get back to 4 wins? I went into this season thinking if they went 4-8, that was certainly not best case scenario, but it also didn't necessarily mean this was a catastrophe, because if you write 4 games off completely and then you give them the Indiana State win and you say, okay, well, now you're 3-4 in the other 7 games. Like, that's not positive, but it's also realistic that a team that lost what it did to the portal and is still in transition might, if they're competitive in all 7 of those games, might just not be able to get across the finish line. And now we're obviously talking about something completely different. And this team has to summon something competitive. So if you show up and compete with Oregon, I think maybe have this game still be worth talking about into the second half. That's a start. They want to do more than that. They want to shock the world, and I think they're going to take their best shot. But I think then you come out of that game and you have the bye week to reassess what you've seen from the past 2 weeks when there's been a significant change. I don't know that Hudson Card's going to be cleared this week, and I also don't know that it necessarily matters. If it's borderline at all, you would probably let Ryan Brown take another shot this week. They've already said, obviously, he's going to start, but I think you want to see his performance from beginning to end last week in Illinois was positive. Like, it was intriguing that he, running the ball so well, and not just that, but it's not just the running. It's it again, like I was saying to James, it's orchestrating those zone reads, and some of those same plays were called early this year for Hudson Card, and I was asking Ryan Walters and Jason Simmons earlier this week about how much do you have to change the offense if you want to play both of these quarterbacks. And Simmons first had said, well, Hudson Card can run these plays. Like, Hudson Card, if we had done this last week, Hudson Card could execute that. And then I thought it was interesting that Ryan Walters then, when I asked a question later, said, I've already told both quarterbacks this is the style we're going to play now. And I'm not trying to put words in his mouth, but we obviously sometimes try to extrapolate and you figure things out from context. And I think you could see a little bit of this is how they want to play, and more so, Ryan Brown executed it the way it should be executed. So maybe Hudson Card took note of that. We'll see coming out of this week where the quarterback thing stands, but there might be still some uncertainty about that going into the bye week. So again, I'm saying I'm throwing out 41-10. I haven't steadied it a lot, but that just in my head seems like a nice round number for an Oregon team that, again, it's a tough thing, man. You just played this emotional roller coaster of a game, and I know Purdue did too, but Purdue got to stop at the beef house on the way home, and Oregon has to fly cross country for a short week and all that goes into that. And by the way, these guys are still going to class and passing tests and stuff. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. I think it's hopefully a good crowd still. They've got the black uniforms. It's going to be a blackout night. So it could just be a fun atmosphere on a Friday night. And you hope that is something that, again, is still compelling late into that game. Let's talk a little bit basketball because, like I said, there's this quick turnaround. I'll be there into the wee hours on Friday night and then back at Mackey Arena midday on Saturday. The fan day scrimmage. From talking to Matt Painter in recent weeks, just talking about the lineup and this developing this starting lineup. Trey Kaufman-Renn, Braden Smith, Fletcher Lawyer, those guys are in the starting lineup. Now, as the preseason went along, Painter shifted from where he was playing those guys kind of spread out to playing them all on one team and then seeing who was fitting with them. And that's been ongoing here in practice the last couple of weeks. But I think the scrimmage will give us an indication possibly of which of those combinations Painter feels have been working the best. I'll be curious to see, and they switch up the lineups. I imagine we're going to see some different lineups. They start off a lot of times with a gold team and a black team. At least is the way it's been in the intra squads I used to cover when I was my first tenure around this team. And they'll start off gold and black, and then guys start turning their jerseys inside out and flipping sides. And we may see those three guys play together. We may see those three guys with some interruptions where one's on the other team. I'm still just fascinated by how this is all going to end up pulling together, because I think the floor is high, and it's just a matter of finding out how high the ceiling is. I think that's a fair assessment at this point. I think you can say when you've got Braden Smith, Fletcher Lawyer, and Trey Kaufman-Renn in some order of importance, Braden Smith, being at number one, but when you've got that baseline and you're adding legitimate talent around it of that fits at each spot that they need. They've got the size. They've got, though inexperience in some ways with Dana Jacobson just being here. They've got some really athletic stuff on the perimeter and guards, but it's Jakari Harris just showed up, and we're going to get to see how that fits right now. And also where those guys are at this stage, like this freshman class, the 5 that came in, like where are those guys after a summer, after what they've done in preseason camp so far? It's just going to be a good indication of kind of taking the temperature of things and being able to more accurately project where this is headed. And then a week later, the game at Creighton, I won't be in attendance for that. I'll be having to watch on whatever it is, Nebraska public access, whatever it is, Omaha, Wayne's World feed or whatever we're getting from there. With everybody else. But there'll be stuff to talk about out of that, because that's a real program. That's a respected program, and they'll probably give Purdue a good look. So I'm going to sign off because it's already pretty late for me. I'm recording this on Wednesday night, like I said, and we'll get this up to you early Thursday. And probably, I don't know what Friday night will tell us about Purdue, unless it's a reversion to what we saw just a few weeks ago. I think that's what I think the goal has to be Friday, is to, Ryan Walters came into the post game and was telling a story about Friday night, seeing that they were running through, ESPN was like running through the games, and a commentator said something like, "Oh, this will be an easy one for Illinois because Purdue's given up on the season." And he took offense to that and went and told his team about it, which I completely understand. But I also understand if that commentator watched the second half of the Wisconsin game, why he said that, or if he watched the Notre Dame game, why he said that. Like there were times when a collapse was afoot. So I think they've got to avoid that. I think they've got to be able to, at the end of the game, say, we fought. That's just a much better roster than what Purdue's is right now. This wasn't the year that upset was going to happen. And maybe we're all wrong, and maybe there's a shocker awaiting us, but we'll find out Friday night. So thanks for joining us. That was Boilers Extra. Talk to you post game, and we'll see you again next week.